All right, now that you have a little overview of the cell, we're going to just talk briefly about metabolism. When you hear the word metabolism, maybe you've heard that you either have a high metabolism or maybe you have a low metabolism. It's all about those chemical reactions that are occurring inside of your cells. So metabolism, the definition, is just all the chemical reactions that occur in our cells. So these are occurring inside of our cells, and sometimes it occurs out in the outside of the cells in the interstitial fluid with the help of enzymes on the surface of cells. But regardless, it's all the chemical reactions that are occurring throughout the body. So when we look at metabolism, there's some important concepts to understand. Is these chemical reactions need a helper. They need something what we call enzymes that speed up the rate of a chemical reaction and allow them to occur at ideal temperatures. For example, our bodies are ideally at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's normal body temperature. So we have enzymes that help our chemical reactions occur at this temperature. Sometimes these chemical reactions would require much higher temperatures, but enzymes help reduce the energy needed for these chemical reactions to occur. So these enzymes are a very important part of chemical reactions. They're not used up in the chemical reaction, so they can be reused over and over again, but some of them are very specific to the chemical reactions that they are involved in. So if we look at kind of just a diagram here, so here's the enzyme, here's the product that we're trying to break down, or I shouldn't say the product, this is the substance that we're trying to break down. For example, maybe this is sucrose, which is a disaccharide. When sucrose interacts with an enzyme, sucrase, that enzyme will break the bond between the two parts of that sugar molecule and release it into two monosaccharides or simple sugars. So this enzyme can be reused again and again and again, and that's the benefit of enzymes. It helps to break things down without being used up in the process. So sometimes we have two simple substances here that will be combined together. A bond is formed by the enzyme to create a two-part substance. For example, if I have two sugar molecules, two glucose units, it interacts with an enzyme and puts a bond between those glucose units, and over time I can build a larger and larger product with a bond between those sugar molecules, and that's what starch and glycogen are. They're just long chains of glucose units, and those glucose units were built with the help of enzymes to create that bond and build that starch and glycogen for storage of energy. And then later, that starch and glucose will be broken down, or not glucose, starch and glycogen will be broken down by this enzyme, which will break the bond and release those sugar units to be used by our cells. So oftentimes these reactions go back and forth, building and breaking down depending on the needs of the body. So again, enzymes lower the energy needed to start a chemical reaction. And sometimes they have some helpers, which are called coenzymes. So vitamins are often helpers to these enzymes and help them work more efficiently. And that's why we need a healthy diet. That's why it's important to get those important B vitamins in our diet, because they help our metabolism work more efficiently. And people talk about foods that are empty calories, like a donut, for example. There are very few to no vitamins in a donut. So even though calories are in the donut and there's sugar in that donut to provide energy, it doesn't have any vitamins to really help metabolism. And that's why when people have a poor diet full of a lot of preservatives, high fat, high carbohydrate, low vitamin foods, they often feel sluggish and tired and have headaches and body aches because they're lacking those coenzymes that are important for metabolism. If you talk to anybody that eats a healthy diet, they'll tell you that their energy level, their mental processing is much, much better when they're eating their healthy foods. But unfortunately, the American diet is full of carbohydrates with chips and hamburgers and pizza and deep fried foods, which really are not good for our metabolism. They cause us to build fat. They cause us to be inflamed and have headaches, depression, fatigue, all those things associated with a lack of coenzymes to help our metabolism. So the mitochondria are important for this special process we call cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is just taking sugar, so you can see the word glucose here. You're taking glucose from the foods we eat and converting it into this stored energy chemical called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, so ATP. So the job of our mitochondria is to take the sugar that we've broken down in the digestive tract and absorbed into the blood, and it's exposed to our cells. Now we're going to take that into our cells, that glucose, with the help of insulin, and we're going to convert it to ATP. That happens in the mitochondria. It's a very efficient process. It takes a little bit of time, but it's an excellent process for producing energy for our cells. So this process requires oxygen. In order to convert glucose to ATP, we need oxygen, which we inhale right through the lungs into the blood. And in the process of converting that glucose to ATP, we release carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide in your exhale is the result of this cellular respiration that's going on inside your mitochondria. So cellular respiration is just getting the energy from the food we eat and converting it into ATP, which is stored energy for our cells. And then our cells will use that ATP to release the energy and allow those cellular processes that require energy, like active transport, endocytosis, exocytosis. Those are important actions by the body that need ATP. Muscle contraction also needs ATP. There's just lots and lots of reasons for making and using ATP throughout the body. So if we look at a mitochondrion, it has these membranes here on the inside. Those membranes are called cristae, and then we have just the open space, which is the matrix, and that's where this cellular respiration occurs. So when we make ATP, if we break off a phosphate, we get ADP, which instead of adenosine triphosphate, now we have adenosine diphosphate. So whenever we remove an ATP remove a phosphate from ATP, we're releasing energy. When we add a phosphate to ADP, we're storing energy. So we have this constant cycle of making ATP and breaking down ATP, depending if we need to store energy or if we need to release energy. So when you look at this process of cellular respiration, it's made up of 3 different chemical reactions: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. The key concept, though, is you're taking that glucose, breaking it down into carbon dioxide and water. So I'm not going to hold you accountable for every step along the way, but just so you understand the names of these steps. So here we have glucose that is leaving the bloodstream, entering into our cell, and oxygen leaving the bloodstream, entering into the cell. So those are the 2 requirements to make ATP. So that glucose is broken down into pyruvate out in the cytoplasm through a process called glycolysis. That pyruvate enters into the mitochondrion. It enters into this process called the citric acid cycle, which occurs in the matrix, in the fluid portion of the mitochondria. And that releases carbon dioxide and makes a little bit of ATP. Then the electron transport chain takes over, and that releases water in the process and makes a lot of ATP. If we look at the amount of ATP made through the reactions of the electron transport chain, we get a lot more ATP in that process compared to the Krebs cycle and glycolysis. But together, these 3 reactions work together. So we have glycolysis first, then the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Together, it makes up a total of about 36 to 38 ATP. So lots and lots of energy stored for our cells. And there's lots of mitochondria within a cell, and there's lots of cells. So we have lots of ATP constantly being made. And again, what's being released in the process? We release carbon dioxide and release water. Those are byproducts of metabolism. What's needed for this process is oxygen and glucose. So we can see that in this diagram. So sometimes there is no oxygen. If there is no oxygen and we need to make ATP, that's going to happen out here in the cytoplasm. It's not going to go into the mitochondria. That pyruvate is going to be broken down and form lactic acid. So we don't get much glucose when we are out in the cytoplasm. with glycolysis, we get the 2 ATP per glucose molecule, but instead of stopping there, that pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid or lactate. And that's the burn you feel in your muscles when you're running up the steps and you don't have enough time to get enough oxygen to those working muscles. We end up going through fermentation in those muscle cells, and that lactic acid causes that burning sensation, which will eventually go away, and stretching is a good way to do that. So that's just a quick overview of metabolism. There's not a lot of detail that you need to remember about that other than the names of the 3 reactions, what's required, which is what we said was glucose and oxygen, and what's produced is 36 to 38 ATP, and then carbon dioxide is released by the citric acid cycle, and water is released from the electron transport chain, and we get this nice amount of ATP, which is stored energy ready to be used by cells.